I was born into a comfortable middle-class family in Germany. It was a happy childhood, perfectly normal elementary school. There was a secondary school where we learned Latin and French and, of course, geography and composition and all those things, in German, to be sure. It also included a bit of physical education, meaning mostly soccer and things like that, because there wasn't much equipment. There was increasing discrimination in the gym class, which basically meant playing soccer, where half of the class was one team and the other half, all boys, one of the guys, and I could name his name today, deliberately fouled me, and the umpire, meaning the classroom teacher, chose not to see it. The social context changed. For example, there was an annual drive of winter relief where they collected clothing, old clothing, blankets, things like that. That used to be done by the military. And then, visible change, it was being done by brown-shirted stormtroopers. I've since figured out what the word totalitarianism means. It means the penetration of the social fabric in 101 ways, where, for example, the German Boy Scouts were converted into the Hitler Youth. 2 divisions, a junior division and a senior division. And the schools organized on Saturdays when there was no longer instruction. There were outings where the fellow students showed up in their brown-shirted uniforms, Hitler Youth. And I remember one guy was a significant exception for a while because he belonged to the uniformed YMCA. In other words, he was not a member of the Hitler Youth, but the YMCA became kind of a parallel organization, and of course, in due time, was absorbed and didn't exist anymore. I remember the Olympics of 1936. No details, but we were on vacation in Switzerland, and I remember the incredible change that occurred. I did not root for Germany. I wanted somebody to win other than Germany, whether it was the Swiss or the US or who, I do not recall. What I do recall emphatically, 36, not Germany. There came a day where my father asked if I was not ready to leave, and I left by myself to go to school in Geneva, where we had a family who were going to look after, and did look after me. And so I had a French language, very competent secondary school for approximately 1 year. My father decided sometime in 1938 that the time has come and signed up for to be interviewed at the American consulate. In those days, to come to the U.S., you needed an affidavit of support. In other words, an American citizen had to provide an affidavit that we would not become public charges. That, fortunately, we could do because my great-grandfather went to California during the gold rush, and he had 6 daughters, including my grandmother, so we had extended family in San Francisco, and they came through and provided the affidavit of support. Small detour. The American consul in Stuttgart declined or refused to admit the affidavit because he said, "Oh, this is an old lady and her guarantee doesn't mean much." So we had to wait until her daughter either co-signed or issued a new affidavit. You may recall that there was in November 1938 the so-called Night of Broken Glass, after which they arrested all Jewish men between the ages of 16 and 60, including my father. He was sent to Dachau, and at the end of 3 weeks, I think, he was discharged. My explanation is they were not prepared. Dachau was not an extermination camp. It was, at that point, it was a concentration camp. It had a bad reputation, and my father was the one never talked about it with one exception, because most of the guards were former German army personnel, and he had been a combat lieutenant in World War I. He kind of knew how to behave in that context, and because he'd been an officer, maybe I'm speculating, he was not treated as badly as some of the others. Anyway, they were overcrowded. They were not prepared to handle that. So he was discharged and signed 2 pieces of paper. One, that he had been treated well, baloney, and 2, that he would leave the country within X weeks, which indeed we had an appointment at the U.S. consulate on the 6th of December, and he was able to keep that. I was at school in Geneva. I returned to Stuttgart long enough to be interviewed in December, returned to Geneva for 2-3 weeks, and then we all met in Paris, where I had to serve as interpreter for my parents because I spoke French. My father had limited English and French, and we embarked on literally Christmas Eve 1938. He was a broken man. He never adjusted in the U.S. It was his lack of competence in English, the degradation from comfortable upper middle class status to approximately penniless immigrants responsible for a family which he used to discharge elegantly and now could no longer do it. He died in San Francisco after a year and a half, I think. And terrible as it is to say that, that was not entirely a bad thing. He was so badly adjusted and broken health. We got hung up in New York for approximately 6 weeks. So I had a taste of an American elementary school. I don't remember it very clearly. I had limited English, but of course it improved daily. We had relatives in New York who helped to adjust. I remember my first visit to an A&P grocery store. I think it was self-service, which was something unusual and different. My knowledge or memory of those 6 weeks in New York is fragmentary because there was so much to learn and, and absorb. Fortunately, we went on to San Francisco, where we adjusted fairly well. As I said, my father died a year and a half later. My mother became a dressmaker, repair person, working from home, and I went to work typically delivering newspapers, that kind of stuff. My kid sister even became a assistant in a vegetable store. All of this within walking distance of home. December 7th, 1941, I was still in bed listening to the radio, and there was an interruption of whatever I was listening to, probably music. Pearl Harbor has been bombed, and obviously we were told what this meant, but I was old enough to understand and realize that this meant the beginning of a very different period. We experienced literally the evacuation of Americans of Japanese descent, and even then I was struck by the difference. Here I was a German enemy alien, and I was not evacuated. I was subject, all of us, of course, subject to limits like, I think it was within 5 miles of home, except to go to work or go to school or things like that. And I did not attend my own high school graduation, and I went to a fortunately, very good high school, Lowell High School, the oldest high school west of the Mississippi. I did not attend my own graduation because it was during the, I don't remember why, but somehow the 5-mile limit came into play. Graduated from high school, had 1 year of, in those days it was called junior college, which was a disaster because I worked a 48-hour week in the shipyards at the same time, which of course is, as I look back on it, preposterous. And in due time, my number came up, and I was sworn in at the Presidio of Monterey. There was at least one neighbor whom I knew, not a friend, but so Eric and I were shipped, along with many others, to Fort Riley, Kansas, home of the Cavalry School, where Eric and I were separated. He went to mechanized cavalry training, basic training. I was sent to the other half, still at Fort Riley, horse cavalry, which even in those days didn't make sense. The American horse cavalry gave up horses officially in the late 30s. So what was I doing in 43 taking horse-mounted basic training? And I remember some incidents which are preposterous. We used radio equipment where the Morse key was strapped to my leg, connected to a generator which was on a separate horse behind me, and somebody had to then hand crank the generator to provide the electricity. Absolutely preposterous in 1943. I was shipped to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and assigned to a mechanized cavalry troop, which was part of the 76th Division. So I became a member of the 76th U.S. Cavalry Troop, parenthesis, mechanized. The table of organization called for me to be promoted to a Tech 5, and I have since learned I was stuck as a Tech 5 because I was still an alien. I remember asking at inductions, where do I go? Because I knew that as soon as I was a member of the military, I was eligible for naturalization. 5-year interval was waived. And they said, not here, not now. So at Fort Riley, I went to the orderly room and said, where do I go to get? Not now, you're just trying to get out of the obstacle course or something like that. So there was a serious delay in my getting naturalized. I had to be naturalized before going overseas. And I remember I was knocked off at least one shipment because they suddenly discovered that I couldn't go overseas as an alien. So in that sense, I escaped several months of overseas service, possibly combat. We were shipped in, well, 4 bunks on top of each other, and if you turned in the middle of the night, your right or left hip would hit the bottom of the guy above you. We're sent to England, where we spent 2 or 3 weeks, and then were sent to France. As I now, with hindsight, realize, we were a reserve division committed as part of the counterattack during the Battle of the Bulge, which, of course, officially is known as the Ardennes Campaign. Gunner radio operator in an armored car. An armored car is not a tank, but it is thin protection with wheels. I don't think I was smart enough to be scared. I was of the right age, and obviously my number was going to come up. It did come up. I was mentally certainly prepared, and obviously had no problems being an American facing the evil Germans. And I remember a terrible night in a slit trench because there was no other place to sleep, and bitterly cold, and then we moved through France, which already was in Allied hands, so this was not combat. Then we moved to Belgium, where we already encountered some enemy action. I guess you could call that our baptism of fire. I remember we were in Bastion, but not at the time of the famous siege and liberation. But we passed through Belgium into Luxembourg, and in Luxembourg we actually had a peaceful interval of 2 weeks waiting to cross over into Germany, because Luxembourg has a river which divides it from Germany. It's called Sauer in German and Sur in French. And so we had maybe a week, 10 days of comfortable living, waiting to cross the Sauer, face the West Wall, which is the German name for what we call the Siegfried Line, which of course is the German equivalent of the Maginot Line. Here we were in Luxembourg, knowing that we had to cross a river and then uphill face German fortifications. We crossed successfully. I think we lost a vehicle or two crossing the Sur, and that was the beginning of a successful counterattack during the Battle of the Bulge, and the beginning of a campaign across Germany until we met the Red Army. We often were the first ones to enter new territory that had or had not been cleared of Germans. I remember my first encounter with a dead German, and of course wanted to grab his Luger pistol, and then remembered, no, don't touch them because they may be wired and booby-trapped. It was also probably my first encounter with death, but it came to him, not to me. We had to proceed very cautiously because the Red Army was moving westward, and we were moving eastward, and we were going to meet and join, as indeed we did. One of our jobs was to guard a enormous prison camp. Again, because I spoke German, I had not normal guard duties of guarding all these prisoners, who were eager to go home, of course, but they represented no threat to us or anybody else. They were glad it was over and they wanted to go home. In fact, we had German troops surrendering to us coming from the east because they, above all, did not want to be Soviet prisoners. Events happened so quickly and so soon and sequentially that I have trouble remembering any particular one. Because I spoke German, I wound up with unusual assignments. When the local German population found out that there was an American who spoke German, they wanted to explain all kinds of things, and I had great difficulty telling him, I do not want to have a conversation with you. It was a spooky feeling to see an environment, or to use a trivial example, the phone booth looked familiar because I remembered it from 5, 6 years earlier. There was a system of points. 1 point for every month of service and a second point for every month overseas. And the high point people at this point, or soon, were shipped home. When the division and the troop, of course, was deactivated, we were shipped to Camp San Francisco, which is in Château-Thierry, France. Château-Thierry, of course, is famous from World War I, but I remember I basically cheated and went to Paris for a day or two on a phony 3-day pass. I figured every company, or in this case troop commander, has the authority to issue a 3-day pass. There's no way the MPs can discern whether this was a legitimate company commander or me forging it. And that is how I managed maybe 2 days, 3 days in Paris, where if you had a legitimate pass, there was housing. Seeing I did not have that, I did not want to take a chance. Well, with my approximately fluent French, I was able to find sleeping accommodations on my own. And from Camp San Francisco, I was shipped back to Germany. I didn't have enough points to go home. And I was assigned to USFET. This was Eisenhower's headquarters, not SHAEF, that was the combat name, but U.S. Forces European Theater, USFET, didn't know what to do with me, so I became a clerk under a WWII captain, which I did not resent. For reasons not clear to me, I was assigned to a jeep to drive a colonel to the airport. And the colonel turned to me and says, "Well, how do you like your job, Corporal?" And I said, "Frankly, sir, I don't. I'm bored. I have skills which incredibly enough, a few days later, I was transferred to Bad Homburg, a suburb of Frankfurt, the precursor of the U.S. Information Agency today. In those days, it was called Information Control Division, where I had an interesting assignment. I became the editor of a daily digest of all anti-American activities in the American zone of occupation. I don't remember the details, but most of the incidents were a German soldier would come home and find his wife or his girlfriend shacked up with an American, and that was anti-American activity. There were stories of werewolves in the mountains of Bavaria and things like that. There was no meaningful resistance, and my daily digest was a bore. I've been trying to find it because I live in Washington, and the National Archives out in Maryland I found lots of interesting things, but I've not been able to find my digest. Since I was part of the Information Control Division, I had to go to the opera, I had to go to the theater to see whether it had anti-American content. It was pleasant duty in one sense, no financial problems, because if you went to the barber shop, yes, they took your money, but that's not what mattered. If you paid in cigarettes or chocolate bars. And by now there was a PX operating in Munich, not Regensburg. So we were wealthy because whatever we wanted, we could pay for it. So here I was, probably barely 21, making judgments about 40-year-old men, whether they were politically tainted or not. We also engaged in something called post-publication scrutiny. That means we read the local newspaper to see whether it contained anti-American content or not. We had to go to the theater, and sure enough, they staged a play which dealt with whatever opposition in the French Revolution there was, and so we had to make a judgment whether this could be translated into current events. It was pleasant duty, and I don't remember our ever finding anything objectionable. I guess as a footnote, there was a feeling of getting even, of fighting back against a country that had disowned me, to put it gently, and now I was a comfortable American with a chance to get even. We were fighting a totality, not individuals. From Regensburg, for example, I went back to Stuttgart, my ex-hometown, and looked up some neighbors, and I remember one guy in particular, the older days, lived 2 houses down from me, and from Regensburg I went to Stuttgart, and I rang his doorbell. His sister opened the door and looked scared, and then she recognized me, and it turned out Herman, her brother, had come home from an American prisoner of war cage 2 days before, and here was a uniformed American about to take him back. And then she realized who I was. And Herman and I basically toured our own neighborhood together, smoking American cigarettes. And I do not remember arriving in New York. I do not remember, presumably by rail, the cross-country trip. I do not remember arriving. I don't even remember the welcome of my mother and sister. It just felt good. I promptly went from San Francisco to Berkeley, where I was admitted to the University of California. The awareness or realization that the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, known as the GI Bill, is a marvelous event law decision by Congress. It is generous, thoughtful. I never used the home loan provisions, but it transformed us because it changed American suburbs, and in my case, it meant a marvelous education. Let me get in a good word for the state of California, which enacted its own version of the GI Bill, so that, in my case, I exhausted the federal benefits. I could use the California state benefits. And that enabled me to have a Bachelor of Arts, a Master of Arts, and a Ph.D. The wartime experience, well, there was a war, and I was going to become involved, and I did. Mercifully, I did not. Okay, I was wounded once, but not a major event. So I escaped successfully. I would not want to be a member of my generation without having served, preferably in combat. In my generation, that is something we should have done because others of my generation did it or had to do it. I'm glad of the experience after the end of combat, of hostilities, serving in military government certainly was a maturing experience. Lots of responsibility for a 21-year-old, completely disproportionate. Fine, I had it. It helped me mature. World War II is the last time we won a war. There have been various interventions, Korea, Vietnam, which I deplore. I don't use the word fascism lightly because I remember historically that was something Mussolini created, and I even know where the word fascism comes from. No, I prefer to talk about totalitarianism because it is a form of government that penetrates substantially all layers of social life. The trivial example I use is the uniformed YMCA in Germany was taken over, as were the Boy Scouts, Pathfinders, into Hitler Youth, Junior Division, Senior Division. That is totalitarianism. That is the penetration of the social fabric. Unfortunately, yes, we have it, but we don't have it in fascist form. We have it in a essentially democratic form. Imperfect as it is, it's pretty damn good. I can't think of any other country that I will want to be a citizen of. I am now 98 years old. I didn't expect to reach this age. By the way, next month I'll be 99. So what? So I'm here. I'm in surprisingly good health. I don't know why anybody would care on what we are recording in this session. Thank you.